paper in part comes out of my thinking about the President's address from the International Sociology of Religion Conference last year. Carol Double-Air presented a paper in which he suggested that we kind of get rid of sociology of religion and turn it into a sociology of ideologies that could include non-theistic philosophical thinkings. I must admit that I came away with exactly the opposite idea. I had for some time been promoting the idea that sociology of religion and indeed religious studies as a whole and the various disciplines we use to come at religion should broaden itself out to include atheism, modern unbelief, humanism, and consider them using all of the tools that we have accumulated over the last century to study religion. In that regard, I make note of the fact that during the last decade, atheism has been put back on the agenda of the religious community in a way that it has not had in a long time. I entered seminary in 1964, just as the death of God controversy was beginning. That controversy would peak during my seminary years in 66, 67. And I was very fortunate to get to know all of the Death of God theologians who we invited to our campus in Chicago, and especially Bill Hamilton, who actually was a child of Evanston, Illinois. His family lived there. He had grown up in First Baptist Church in Evanston, and he came to Evanston quite regularly to visit his family that was still there. And thus that became part of my thinking along the way. As for a few years I was quite a devotee of Death of God thought before I finally discovered the truth that Steve Martin has recently emphasized again, that the atheists don't have no music, and that's their real problem. But during the last decade, after about three decades of neglect in terms of our thinking, atheism has been put back on the agenda. All three of the last three popes have made speeches emphasizing that with all of the issues that they have had to deal with, that they believe that atheism is the main challenge that they have to face as leaders of the largest Christian community in the country. In 2004, 2005, a new set of atheist advocates emerged who we came to know as the neo-atheists, Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens being the most prominent ones, who were articulating a new, very aggressive form of atheism, which not only denounced religion, said they didn't want to be a part of it, it's false, but who said, went much further and said religion is actually harmful and that we should get rid of it because of all of the harm that it does to the human race, and have tried to turn it into a human rights question. In the meantime, a whole set of different atheist groups that fit out along a spectrum that I want to take a look at have been formed. And this is where come full circle. I think with these new atheist groups, it's very appropriate to begin to think of them in the same categories that we have been using to describe new religious groups, and begin to see how they function somewhat as new religions, but religions without a supernatural component. Now, that's an idea that most of the members of these groups would deny, but I think in terms of the history of their origin and the programs that they are trying to initiate now, that it seems to be a very appropriate thing. We say just a little bit about the history of unbelief. Unbelief emerges in the 16th century as a challenge to Christian orthodoxy. The first steps to get to what in the 18th century would become atheism, one had to move away from the all-pervasive orthodoxy of the 15th century and before. And this happens at the time of the Reformation. Along with Lutherans and Calvinists and radical reformers and the new Anglicans, there emerged some small groups that challenged essential Christian beliefs, and particularly the complex belief of the Trinity. This is where we get the modern Unitarian movement, and it briefly thrived in Poland and then settled down to a life on the fringe of society in Transylvania, was finally transmitted across Europe, and particularly lands in England, where it survives on the margin, largely the margin of the Baptist Church in England for a century or more. But it provides an opening in which people can begin to challenge the supremacy of Christian orthodoxy, and in which new ideas can emerge and people begin to articulate a belief system that does not include God. Now, in the 18th century, the first people pop up who are actually publishing and saying publicly that they have no belief in God. The first two or three who do this are quickly dispatched, but eventually a number of people emerge, such as the philosopher Spinoza, who are able in a sophisticated sort of way to present a non-theistic system of belief, and do so in a way that doesn't cause them to become victims of blasphemy laws and various regulations about defying the church. Spinoza got away with it in Holland, which was the most religiously tolerant country in Europe at the time, and also did it by not trying to have any organizational attack upon the church. It was merely an ideological attack that was directed at his fellow scholars. And with his sophisticated way of speaking, he was able to survive, at least not get killed. He got excommunicated from the Jewish community, of course, but he was able to live out his life in relative peace. It is at this time then that a new movement arises in England called Deism. Deism and Unitarianism are often conflated with each other, but they're two very distinct movements. They agreed on one point that in terms of that there was only one God and he was not Trinitarian, and all of the other ideas that go with it, namely that Jesus was not God, and that hence the normal doctrine of salvation would have to be discarded. But where the deists took their implications was in a much different direction. What they assumed was that God had, the one God had created the world, but then removed himself from the world, and was now so distant from the world and so unconcerned with the world that worship was irrelevant. God had no concern for the world, thus there was no point in worshiping him. He didn't care about your worship. He was also so distant that he didn't interact with the world on any kind of day-to-day basis, and hence there was no point in prayer. God wasn't listening to prayer, as he was unconcerned about worship, and God did not perform miracles. Miracles were something else other than the intervention of God. Now, also where deism radically differs from Unitarianism is that deism is a movement within the Anglican community. It is a theological movement, not an organizational movement. Whereas Unitarians were forming Unitarian churches, conducting worship and carrying on as Christians who simply didn't believe in the Trinity. The deists were not doing any of that. They were writing books, challenging intellectual structures, but built no organizations. They did not challenge the Anglican establishment in England other than by challenging a few ideas of their theologians and bishops. When Anglicanism moves to America, it moves into a situation in which there was a formal Anglican establishment throughout the British colonies, but an establishment that had little or no power because the Bishop of London refused to authorize the consecration of a bishop for the American colonies. And hence, there was an Anglican church, but most people could never get confirmed because you need a bishop to confirm members. This was George Washington's position, for example. He went to church quite regularly but refused to take communion because he had never been confirmed. And thus some of the ambiguous observations on Washington's Christianity. Deism becomes an important movement in America. Thomas Jefferson is a deist. John Adams, our second president, was a Unitarian. It is believed that George Washington was a deist. He was certainly an active Freemason, and Freemasonry was a deistic religious belief. What Mike said about the needs for studying Freemasonry are all important in terms of American history, and it's a history that's distorted by the Morgan affair and the changes that occur in Freemasonry after the murder of William Morgan in the 1840s. That's another one of the problems we have of working on this history. But essential problems come in understanding the place of atheism in American religion because of some other important considerations. First of all, the atheists don't know how to write history. They seem to have stopped reading any kind of history with Thomas Carlyle, and they write history in a very broken manner as the history of great exponents of atheism. And there's no connection. If you read atheist history, it's just sort of a set of biographies. It's like reading a biographical dictionary of all these great people who were atheists, and there's no connection between them. There's no attempt to show how atheism grew and spread. And then there's several problems with atheism. Is how did we get from the deism of the 1770s and the Founding Fathers to the first real atheists in America that show up after the Civil War? That's a problem that they have never tackled. In one sense, when you start looking at it, it becomes very simple, namely that deism morphed into another movement called Freethought. And free thinking was a very popular idea. And it grew and grew and grew through the first half of the 19th century and was very much assisted by the fact that during the 1840s and 50s, large number of European atheists moved to the American frontier. And from Wisconsin to Texas, you have a whole set of atheist organizations being formed, mostly by Germans and Czechs. The Czechs are in Nebraska and Missouri, the Germans are in Wisconsin and Texas, and they formed the first real atheist organizations, but they're all very, very local. But they're there. And they have room to grow because most people aren't Christians. That's one of the real problems in telling American religious history, is that when the dust from the revolution settles, only about 10 to 15% of the American public remain church members when they were no longer defined as church members by their birth. And by the end of the 19th century, only 30% of the American public were church members. That meant that 70% were nuns. And the history of America is just different from the rest of Europe, certainly. It's closer to Canada. It's certainly different from South and Central America. Is that we started out with a secular country in which Christianity is a small minority. Now, it's the only religious group, except for a couple of synagogues, but it's a very small minority. And through the 19th century, the church grows significantly because population is growing. We go from 10 million to 75 million, but it's still only about 30%. We did not reach a Christian majority in this country until World War II. And now we're up to 70%, above 70, somewhere between 70, closing in on 80% of the public are church members at this point. That means that that group of people who were irreligious, unconcerned about religion, not attending any church anywhere, goes from 90% of the population. By the end of the 19th century, it's 65%. By the World War II, it's 50%. Today, it's less than 10%. We have been, with this new emphasis on atheism, as atheism has been put back on the agenda recently, we've been seeing, well, atheism, unbelief is growing. No, it's not growing. It's declining, and it's declining rapidly, and it has been steadily declining in this country for 200 years, going from 90% now to less than 10%. But there's still some interesting components to all of this decline. Atheism itself is growing. It's a small movement, and its origins are in Unitarianism. After the Civil War, the first national atheist organization finally emerges and develops a large-scale presence in America. And it's done because the catalyst for its formation is the formation of the American Unitarian Association. When the American Unitarian Association finally forms after the Civil War, there are a group of ministers who say, we do not want the Unitarian Church to be exclusively Christian. We want some room for people who believe in God but are not necessarily Christian. Among them are several members of the Reformed Jewish community. The Unitarian Church votes on this twice, has two intense debates, and decides against it. They say, we're going to be Unitarian Christians. And it is those radical Unitarians who then leave and form what's called the National Liberty League, the first atheist organization. That organization continues through the rest of the century, does good work, finally flounders in the second generation when there's no one to replace Robert Ingersoll, who is its major spokesperson, and a set of, again, of regional organizations carry on. But by World War II, at the time when Christianity becomes the majority, we get our first real count on how many atheists are there. Among all these people who are not hanging around in any church anywhere, who are irreligious or less religious or just don't care about religious questions, there are 4 million atheists that are found in the first national survey that asked people about belief in God. So in 1944, there are 4 million people who define themselves as atheists. How did we get there? Because the organizations aren't getting them there. If we take all the organizational membership at this time, we're probably talking 20,000, 30,000 people. But atheism has never been carried by the atheist organizations themselves, at least not until recently. Atheism was carried by a number of labor movements, number of political movements. Marxism was quite strong particularly in northern urban areas at the beginning of the 19th century. Number of psychological clubs that had developed out of Freudian attention to Freudian and new psychotherapy groups had developed. On the campuses, philosophy clubs had emerged and had become hotbeds of atheism. Pragmatism, America's first real homegrown philosophy, was atheist in its content, and that was one of the places that it carried. But that 4 million atheists who show up in 1940 represent 4% of the population in that first national poll. Now, one of the interesting things about atheism, in spite of the neo-atheist movement and other things that happened, is that the percentage of atheists in the population has remained unchanged in the United States now for, 80 years? It is still 4% today. In other words, the atheist community has grown because the population has tripled since 1944, but the percentage in the community has remained exactly the same. Now, where does that leave us in terms of the atheist community? What has radically changed over the last generation is that now, instead of no national organizations, during this generation, 7 national atheist organizations competing with each other and presenting the spectrum of atheist positions has reappeared. Among the first of these was the American Humanist Association, which remains the largest, and over half of the atheists who are part of an organization are members of the American Humanist Association. This is another Unitarian split. In the 1930s, a group of radical Unitarian ministers who had lost their belief in God formed the American Humanist Association. They found John Dewey as a spokesman for them, and they created the American Humanist Association, which currently has about 200 centers around the country and is very pro-religion. That is, they have ministers, they perform weddings, funerals, even christenings, but do it all in a context without belief in God. In 1950, Madalyn Murray O'Hair, down in Austin, just south of here, formed the American Atheists. Anti-religious, no God, no religion, no supernaturalism, completely secular kind of lifestyle. Finally, in the 1990s, a Jewish rabbi outside Detroit in Birmingham, Michigan, forms a atheist synagogue and starts the American Jewish Humanist movement. So now we have these 3 main groups: the atheist, the humanist, and the Jewish humanist. And each of those have now created splinter groups, so that there are now 7 groups that are nationally based: Congress of Secular Jews, the Center for Inquiry, which is the old Council of Secular Humanism, has come along, and then another early Jewish group that has aligned itself with the American Humanist Association, the Ethical Culture Movement. That's sort of the good news for the atheist community, because they've been the neo-atheist community has come about because of the frustration of the lack of growth of atheism. The neo-atheists, as far as we can tell, have not contributed to the growth of atheism at all, but they have mobilized the community. And now that they have these effective organizations, one of the atheist groups, Freedom from Religion Foundation, has become well known for the many lawsuits it's brought in trying to get In God We Trust taken off of the money and removed as our motto for the country. they're the ones who file most of the lawsuits that have to do with Ten Commandments tablets in courthouses and things like that, that there is a possibility that atheism might begin a growth phase. But it is still the case that there's only about, if you take the membership of all these groups and put them together, we're talking somewhere between 1 and 200,000 of the now 12 to 15 million atheists in the country. So, thank you.